Now that we've introduced the classifications of monomers and polymers to refer to singular or groups of nutrients, it's time to take a look at how these terms can be used for each of the four major nutrient families that are found in pretty much all life on Earth, starting with the first family, what we call the carbohydrates, although most people simply refer to these by the short form of carbs. Now, if you're not familiar with the term carbohydrates, surely you're familiar with the term sugars, because these terms are actually identical. Carbohydrates just gives us a little bit more specific information about the chemical structure of sugars. For example, we can look at the prefix carbo and infer that carbon is the central element found in sugars, which is the case of all organic molecules. From the root of this word hydra, we know that hydra or hydro is a reference to water, and from this we can come up with the general formula for carbohydrates, where if a carbohydrate has n amount of sugar, it will also have n amount of water within its chemical structure. And if we take a look at the most common carbohydrate monomer that exists, this molecule here, which is a sugar called glucose, we can see that its chemical formula matches this general formula here, where if n equals 6, the number of carbons, it will also have 6 water molecules, which would give it 12 hydrogen and 6 oxygen, respectively. Now, in terms of the function that carbohydrates serve, we say that carbohydrates act as your short-term energy molecules, meaning that as long as there are sugars present within your body will prioritize sugars as being used first over the other energy storage molecule, which are what we call fats, but more on that later. Now, depending on whether you are a plant or whether you are an animal, if you have extra sugar in your body, it is stored in one of two possible carbohydrate polymers. If you are a plant, you would store your carbohydrates in the form of starch, which is most likely found in the roots of a plant or in the seeds of a plant. For example, potatoes are the root of potato plants and are basically made entirely of the potato starch reserves. If you are an animal, you obviously do not have roots, and instead you would store your carbohydrates or your monomer carbohydrates in the form of a larger, more complex polysaccharide or carbohydrate polymer known as glycogen, which is primarily found in the liver and in your muscle cells. Now, plants have an additional type of carbohydrate polymer, what we call cellulose, because plants have a cell wall. Now, animals do not require a cell wall because we have skeletons that are able to allow us to stand upright without falling over, and the cell wall serves this function in plants because obviously plants need to be able to stand upright in order to absorb as much energy from the sun as possible, and this is only possible through the aid of a specific carbohydrate polymer that we call cellulose. Now, the next family of nutrients are what we call the lipids, which is not a particularly familiar word. However, if we were to say the word fats, this is certainly a lot more familiar. Now, fats are not synonymous with lipids. These two words don't mean the same thing. Instead, lipids refer to any large nutrients that share similar structures that don't mix well with water, and fats are just the most common variety of it and the most easy to talk about in terms of monomers and polymers. For example, this unit here, this whole structure here, is what we call a fatty acid, and this is the monomer form of fats, whereas if we take 3 fatty acids and join them to a central storage molecule, they form structures that we call triglycerides. And from the name triglyceride, you can probably see that there are going to be 3 of something, in this case 3 fatty acids, and these exist as your body's fat storage molecules. Whenever your body has accumulated extra fats, it stores them in the form of triglyceride molecules. Now, contrasting these with carbohydrates, fats function as the body's long-term energy source, meaning that if your body has an equal amount of sugar and fat, it will prioritize breaking down the sugars first before breaking down fats. And this is why most people find that losing weight by burning fat is much more difficult to do than consuming carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are always consumed first. Now, another fat polymer or lipid polymer that serves a completely different function are fat molecules that we call phospholipids. And if we take a look at a phospholipid structure, we can see that there is a fatty acid here, and we can see that there is a fatty acid here. So technically this is a polymer, but from the prefix phospho, we can see that there is an additional structure here made up of the polyatomic ion phosphate. And this is still considered a polymer because we've joined multiple smaller molecules together, but this polymer here serves a completely different function than the long-term energy storage of triglycerides. This is the primary component of every cell's membrane. And when you learn about the chemical basis behind phospholipid structure, you will understand why this molecule is so necessary in terms of forming the cell membrane structure. However, what we're primarily interested in here is the composition, the nutrient composition of phospholipids and triglycerides as being two of the fat molecules that are broken down by the digestive system. Now, our third family is by far the most complex. It's what we call the proteins. Now, proteins are exceedingly complicated and multifunctional, so much so that they're going to get their own separate video when we talk about one of their functions. So for now, what we can say is that the monomer, the individual building block that makes up proteins, are what we call your amino acids. So whenever you consume protein from soybeans or from meat or any other rich protein source, what your body is interested in are the amino acids, which your body breaks protein down into in order to build up its own proteins. And once again, in future videos, we will talk more about the detailed functions that proteins have. But typically, when we refer to proteins, we are referring to the polymer form of amino acids. When we take many amino acids together and join them together into a polymer, your body is making a protein. Which brings us to our final nutrient family, and also the nutrient family that no nutritionist considers to be a nutrient, what we call your nucleic acids. Now, if we were to say the word nucleic acid, this is not helpful for most people until we look at the first two letters of nucleic acids, N and A. Now, if you think about two very, very important molecules for the maintenance and day-to-day life of your cell, you will probably think of DNA, which is the storage or genetic library of your genetic code, and RNA, which is the carrier, that molecule that carries the genetic code out of your cell's nucleus and acts as the individual blueprint for making specific proteins. DNA and RNA, the NA within their chemical or within their names, actually stands for nucleic acids, which is the type of nutrient that they fall into. Now, DNA and RNA are the polymer forms of nucleic acids, which means that when you eat the DNA and RNA of another organism, your digestive system breaks DNA and RNA down to their respective monomers, which are structures that we call nucleotides, which we can see down here. Now, because of their structural complexity as well as their chemical complexity, typically we don't look at the chemistry of DNA and RNA until grade 12. So suffice to say, what we need to know is your digestive system takes the DNA and RNA found in the cells of organisms that you've eaten and breaks them down into individual nucleotides so that you can use these in order to construct your own DNA every time your DNA is duplicated and construct individual RNA molecules every time your body needs to produce a protein. This concludes this part of the introductory series on introducing each of the nutrient families. In the next series of videos, we're going to take a deep dive at one of the specific functions of proteins, specifically enzymes, and why enzymes are important for the function of the digestive system.